Wushuwnoag ni tampa kan tabamag as katasquamson. Good evening, friends and family. How are you doing? Neesu Wushuwnoag, Director General of the Federation of Aboriginal Nations of the Americas. It's been quite some time since I last shared some thoughts, but as I mentioned, our policy in FANA now is to engage when there's subject matter to engage about. We got some really great things to kind of share about. First, just had a fantastic third annual Meshanticut Cultural Placemaking Confestival last week in Providence. Really great event. The theme for this year's Confestival was economic development, living culture, and tourism, and how the three intersect, excuse me, particularly in the space of placemaking. Really great event. Really great dialogue. Had fantastic ambassadors participating. Queen Amanimli from Mali, Ambassador Cynthia Ellis from the Garifuna out of Belize, and Ambassador Felicita Cantu from the Maya out of Belize, as well as other individuals as well. Really well experienced event. Just a really great time. There should be some visuals and things of that nature out, some of the workshops and things of that nature as well. So coming off of that, just really in good spirits and excited because we're having conversations around economic development and things that move our nations forward in the Federation. And that's really encouraging and humbling, because in the past we were in spaces of really talking about all of the issues that are facing us, and now we're having conversations about moving things forward. Prior to that, however, some really impactful and profound things were taking place with FANA, and I just want to touch base on some of them this evening, so that folks will be a little bit more informed in case they are wondering exactly what's going on. So the first element I want to discuss is that FANA Council passed a decree on the law of continuity, which is so fundamental to international law, but it's something that not many folks are even aware of, despite that it is foundational to so many doctrines that impact the rights of indigenous nations and peoples. So just for a little bit of overview, the law of continuity, it's a concept that has been around for a very long time. If I'm not mistaken, it was acknowledged by ancient Egypt. And there are a number of different perspectives to view it from. If we view it from a philosophical perspective, it basically confirms that sovereignty is unbroken and continuous, even when colonial powers claim interruption. So we know that there is the doctrine of discovery, which says that when they discovered the lands, it became underneath their authority. But then in direct opposition to that, you have the law of continuity. So you have the doctrine of discovery, the law of continuity, which says that sovereignty is unbroken and continuous, even when colonial powers claim interruption. From a legal perspective, the law of continuity, when you apply it to indigenous rights and indigenous sovereignty, confirms that indigenous legal systems continue unless they are explicitly and lawfully extinguished. And this is even acknowledged in U.S. law. I think one of the fundamental misunderstandings about sovereignty is folks think that it is granted. You have to go and get your sovereignty. No. Sovereigns are sovereigns. They are inherently sovereign simply because they exist. And so from a legal perspective, the law of continuity says unless that sovereignty has been explicitly and lawfully extinguished, it exists simply because of the sovereign's existence. Then we can take the political perspective, and this is that sovereignty evolves in expression, but persists through self-governance and adaptation. So your sovereignty can be reflected in different forms and fashions. So if I give a very kind of, might be a weird example, we used to fish maybe with spears. Now we might use a fishing pole. The sovereignty is inherent in the fact that we have the right to fish in our traditional waterways and riverways and things of that nature, but the way that we exercise or express that sovereignty may evolve. However, it only persists through the self-governance and adaptation. So we have to exercise it. That's how it persists. It can be expressed and it can be evolved in its expression, but it persists through governing of the sovereign governing itself and adapting to the scenarios in which the sovereignty is expressed and played out. And then if we view it from a spiritual and relational perspective, continuity of relationships to land, people, and law reflects an ongoing exercise of sovereignty. So by keeping your ceremonies, traditions, things of that nature alive, you demonstrate that your sovereignty is still alive and well and functioning. So that's kind of general. And if we have to put all that together, when applied to indigenous sovereignty, the law of continuity would challenge colonial narratives of rupture and extinguishment, while also affirming that indigenous peoples' authority and identity have always existed in continuity. They're not relics of the past. They evolve and are living forms of sovereignty. So let's go a little bit deeper, shall we? In international law specifically, the law or principle of continuity refers to the doctrine that sovereign rights, particularly territorial sovereignty, is presumed to continue unless it's lawfully extinguished. The principle supports the idea that territorial title or sovereignty, it doesn't lapse simply due to non-use or a lapse in control. So your sovereignty, your nation's sovereignty doesn't go away because they haven't been exercising the sovereignty. It's still there. Unless a competing sovereign effectively extinguishes it through legal or recognized means like conquest, followed by recognition, cession, or abandonment. And is often invoked in cases involving colonial successor states, indigenous sovereignty, and disputes over historical claims. Now, when we look at U.S. engagement with the principle, sometimes it's expressed under territorial sovereignty claims, and these types of territorial disputes, such as the ones that are argued before, like the International Court of Justice or other tribunals, U.S. positions have at times implicitly invoked or acknowledged elements of continuity. So the U.S., when it's to the U.S.'s benefits, it'll acknowledge elements of continuity. Some of the cases are like the island of Palmas in 1928. It wasn't a U.S. victory, but the arbitration emphasized continuous and peaceful display of authority over mere discovery. The U.S. lost the case, but its argument, apologies for that, but its argument presumed a form of continuity from Spanish to U.S. sovereignty via cession. So the U.S. is acknowledging the concept when it's to its benefit. However, in domestic matters like Puerto Rico or in quote-unquote Native American lands, the U.S. has at times argued against continuity of foreign or indigenous sovereignty. But, indigenous nations have continually argued continuity of pre-colonial sovereignty under U.S. trust responsibility or treaty law. So those are the nations that have that relationship. But the point being that the U.S. is kind of iffy with it. When it works to its benefit, it'll acknowledge it. When it doesn't want it to, then it'll argue against it. Now, when we look at specific case law precedent that deals with Indian tribes, when you look at the Marshall Trilogy, which includes cases like Worcester v. Georgia, there's a traces of the continuity doctrine in that it recognizes that Native nations have pre-existing sovereigns whose rights persist unless lawfully extinguished. And in particular, in Worcester v. Georgia, the court determined that the Indian nations had always been considered the distinct, independent political communities retaining their original natural rights. But of course, out of that same trilogy came the concept of domestic dependent nation, which, is problematic way to look at a sovereign. And then when you look at foreign policy and recognition, the U.S. has used or resisted the law of continuity depending on its strategic interests. It recognizes continuity in states like China or Iran, where regimes change, but the U.S. maintained recognition of the same state. And then it rejects continuity in cases of secession or non-recognition, such as breakaway regions or unrecognized governments. So in this respect, in international law cases, it's selective based on the context. In domestic tribal law, it's implicit recognition via pre-existing sovereignty, but once again, that domestic dependent status pops in. In territorial disputes, it's argued both sides, both continuity and discontinuity. But as a formal legal doctrine, the U.S. has not formally adopted it under statutes or case law as a standalone principle. Now, of particular interest, when you look at this concept of the law of continuity, this is the basic concept and sort of fundamental grounding for things like the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. The fact that sovereignty is inherent and exists, and that whether or not colonial structures and powers want to acknowledge it or not, indigenous peoples, indigenous nations, they have rights that they can exercise. So, recognizing that this was a principle that was out there, and recognizing that the UNDRIP and the ADRIP allows indigenous peoples to exercise their sovereignty, or it not allows, apologies, I'm using completely wrong language, acknowledges and confirms that indigenous peoples have the right to exercise this sovereignty. The FANA nations chose to codify the law of continuity by decree within FANA law, Federation law, and make it synonymous with the concepts of Wushuwnoag, which is FANA's overarching legal principles that guide all of the aspects of how the FANA nations direct and conduct themselves. So this law of continuity is fundamental to all of these elements that you hear indigenous folks talking about. Once again, it is on those indigenous nations to exercise that sovereignty. It's not enough to just say you have it. So what? If you've got $1 million, but you never actually take the $1 million and do anything with it, then you just got $1 million. So if you have sovereignty, but you never take and exercise that sovereignty, then you got sovereignty. And the FANA nations are in the business and very intentional about exercising their sovereignty. So that decree was put into, that law of continuity is put into a decree. And the FANA nations are starting to build on it. Now, the point being that this is the law of continuity, which means it confirms that things that were there before remain after. They evolve, they adapt, but they remain after. This necessitates that you have been there before. This is why it works for the FANA nations, because every FANA nation can point to the fact that before European contact, they were there in their lands. There's a blood connection to these lands. There's proof, there's history there, there's genealogy, there's oral tradition, there's culture. There's all of these things that are confirmed to tie every FANA nation to its specific lands. And this is why new nations being formed, new confederations being formed, political bodies popping up and claiming lands that they were never in doesn't work, because it's not tied to any continuity. You're starting something new. And if you're going to start something new, after the Europeans have made their claims to a particular space, why would your claims be any stronger or more legit than theirs? See, there's this phenomenon going around that if I speak the proper rhetoric, if I draft up documents that cite all of the history and cite all of the international law and the federal law and whatever laws, and I can look the part, that somehow I transform into the peoples that have the authority to make these claims. And that's not how it works. The continuity doesn't work because you've modeled what other folks are doing and you've got yours too. The continuity works because you are those original people. And no matter what this colonial structure says, no matter what the doctrine of discovery, no matter what any of that says, you exist inherently from Creator. That's where your authority stems from. Not from approval, not from recognition, not from paperwork, not from a trust, not from any of that. But because you are and always have been, and you represent and are a manifestation of that has always been there. So in that respect, the FANA nations have adopted this law of continuity, and now, you might have seen this as well, because we've been doing a lot, are now moving into the space of forming a international Indigenous Human Rights Tribunal so that we can address issues of violations of our indigenous human rights amongst ourselves. Why? Because that's what we would have done before European contact. That's what warrior societies are about. That's what chiefs are for. All of this is there because it's an exercise of inherent sovereignty that, because we've been dealing with this colonial system, we're now having to adapt and kind of modify to deal with contemporary times, but we still have the inherent sovereignty to do it. So check out the things that have been being posted on the Federation Facebook page, on the IG account. The law of continuity, which then feeds into our international human rights and all of the other things that the Federation is doing. I want to impress upon you, and I've said this on numerous occasions and I'll continue to say it, it's because we have always been here. It's not, once again, because we formed a trust. That is a new evolution and adaptation that we've added so that we can better express our sovereignty in contemporary times. But we're not sovereign because we created a trust. We're not sovereign because we created a constitution. We're not sovereign because we had a Confestival. We're not sovereign because we got recognized. We're not sovereign for any other reason than that we are from these inherently sovereign nations and peoples that have been around, whose sovereignty, if you're looking for a place where sovereignty comes from, it comes from Creator. It was given to us by Creator. That's where our sovereignty comes from. So just wanted to touch base a little bit on that, the law of continuity. Please look into it. And I want to caution anyone out there about trying to come up with new things and then claim these doctrines that relate to folks that were already there. You're going to get yourself into trouble. You're going to get yourself put on some federal list as a national security threat. You might get yourself put on the FANA list as a national security threat. The rights come from having been there. If you don't know who you are, that's the first step. Once you know who you are, you need to go get with your peoples, because you're not going to be able to make these claims individually on your own. And if you checked and you haven't found, then please don't figure, well, I'm just going to try to go and do something myself, and I'm just going to go and adapt these things, and I'll do up a trust, and I'll have all the language, and I'll speak, and I'll get my ribbon shirt, and then I'll go dance at the powwows and all that, and that'll make me what I really want to be, and then It is by the blood, it is by the inherent existence that exists through you, that comes from your ancestors, that was given from Creator. That's where the sovereignty comes from. And when you're inherently sovereign in that regard, then the law of continuity confirms that your rights exist, they adapt, They evolve. They don't go away because colonial powers step in and say that they don't recognize them. It exists separate from any recognition. Whether you're recognized or not doesn't make you a sovereign. The fact that you are who you are and you represent folks who have been there since time immemorial, that's where sovereignty comes from. So just want to share that. Law of continuity. Please feel free to check out the FANA website. Check out the FANA, like I said, FANA IG pages, Facebook pages. And a few will have information up about the Confestival. And then be on the lookout for that FANA Intertribal Court. But yeah, Katapatush Richard Chusata. Pleasure to connect with you. As always, I'm happy to share a little bit of perspective, give you an update on what the Federation's been up to. I do hope that in all your endeavors, in the path that you're following, you're walking righteously, you're walking with humility and respect, and that your path continues to be blessed by Creator above. Thank you for listening to me. I look forward to connecting with you soon. Aho.